I decided to visit the country house I gave to my wife. The new groundskeeper didn't recognize me. "I'm sorry, sir, but the owner of the house has already arrived." He pointed to her lover, who was giving orders on the porch. I decided to play along. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Colin, and at 57 years old, I thought I knew my wife. After 23 years of marriage, I believed Milena and I had built something solid together. The country house in Vermont had been my gift to her 3 years ago, a place where she could find peace, pursue her art, and escape the pressures of city life. She'd been spending more and more time there lately, claiming she needed space to reconnect with herself. I should have seen the signs. The drive from Boston took me 3 hours, winding through autumn roads painted in brilliant oranges and reds. I hadn't called ahead. I wanted to surprise her. Maybe we could spend the weekend together, just the two of us, like we used to in the early days. God knows we needed it. Our conversations had become stilted, formal, like two strangers sharing a house rather than a life. The wrought iron gates came into view around the final bend, and my heart lifted slightly. The property looked magnificent in the fall light, the old colonial house sitting proudly among the maple trees I'd paid $12,000 to have professionally landscaped. Everything appeared perfect from the outside. I pulled up to the gate and pressed the intercom button, expecting it to swing open automatically. Instead, a voice I didn't recognize crackled through the speaker. "Yes. What can I do for you?" I frowned, leaning closer to the intercom. "I'm here to see Milena. I'm her husband." There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps on gravel. A man appeared from the small groundskeeper's cottage, a structure I'd had built last year so Milena wouldn't feel isolated when she stayed alone. He was younger than me, maybe in his early 40s, with the kind of rugged good looks that belonged in a cologne advertisement. He approached my car with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his tone polite but firm, "but the owner of the house has already arrived." The words hit me like ice water. Owner of the house? I stared at him, waiting for recognition to dawn in his eyes, for him to realize his mistake. But his expression remained unchanged, professional, courteous, and completely unaware that he was speaking to the man who held the deed to this property. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "I'm Colin Patterson. This is my house." The man's brow furrowed slightly, but not with recognition, with confusion. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Mrs. Patterson and her husband are here for a private weekend, and they specifically requested no interruptions." Her husband. The words echoed in my head as I sat frozen behind the wheel. Through the bars of the gate, I could see movement on the front porch of my house. A man, not the groundskeeper, but someone else entirely, stood there giving directions to what appeared to be a delivery crew. He gestured with the casual authority of someone completely at home, someone who belonged. My chest tightened as the full weight of the situation settled over me. Milena was here, in the house I'd bought for her, with another man, and somehow, in some way I couldn't yet comprehend, I had been erased from my own property so completely that even the staff didn't know who I was. The groundskeeper was still watching me, waiting for me to drive away. His hand rested casually on the gate latch, but his posture suggested he was prepared to call for backup if needed. How long had he been here? How many times had Milena told him stories about her real husband, the man currently standing on my porch? "Is there something wrong with your hearing, sir?" the groundskeeper asked, his politeness beginning to wear thin. "I need you to move along." Something in his tone, the dismissive way he spoke to me, as if I were some unwanted solicitor, sparked a dangerous idea in my mind. If Milena wanted to play games, if she wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then perhaps I should play along. Perhaps it was time to see just how deep this deception went. I forced my face into what I hoped was an apologetic expression. "You're absolutely right. I'm sorry. I think I may have gotten turned around. I'm actually looking at properties in the area, thinking of buying something for weekend getaways. This place is exactly what I had in mind." The groundskeeper's demeanor shifted immediately. The suspicious edge disappeared, replaced by the helpful attitude of someone who might be speaking to a potential buyer. "Oh, well, I'm afraid this property isn't for sale, sir. The Pattersons are very happy here." Of course, I said, my mind racing. But you know how it is. Sometimes people change their minds if the price is right. Would it be possible to speak with them? Just to express my interest? I watched his face carefully, noting the moment when he glanced back toward the house. He was considering it, weighing whether this was something he should handle himself or pass along to his employers. The fact that he needed to think about it told me everything I needed to know about who really made the decisions here. Well, he said slowly, I suppose there's no harm in asking, but I should warn you, they're quite attached to this place. It's been in the family for years. In the family for years? The lie came so easily from his lips that I almost believed he believed it himself. How many times had Milena fed him this story? How carefully had she constructed this alternate reality where I simply didn't exist? I understand completely, I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Family properties are special, but you never know. Sometimes circumstances change. The groundskeeper nodded and stepped back toward the intercom. As he pressed the button, I caught sight of the man on the porch again. He was tall, well-dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothes that screamed country gentleman. He moved around my porch with the ease of someone who had been there many times before, someone who knew where everything belonged. Mrs. Patterson, there's a gentleman here interested in the property, says he might want to make an offer. I held my breath, waiting for Milena's voice to crackle through the speaker. When it came, it was warm, welcoming, the same tone she used to use with me before everything went cold between us. How wonderful! Send him up to the house. Richard and I would be happy to chat with him. Richard. So the man on my porch had a name. The gate began to swing open with a mechanical hum that I'd heard hundreds of times before, but this time, instead of feeling like I was coming home, I felt like I was entering enemy territory. As I drove up the familiar gravel drive, past the flower beds I'd paid to have professionally designed, toward the house where I'd planned to spend my retirement years, one thought echoed through my mind with crystalline clarity. I was about to meet the man my wife had replaced me with, and he had no idea he was about to shake hands with a ghost. The crunch of gravel under my tires sounded different somehow, as if the very driveway was rejecting my presence. I parked beside a sleek black Mercedes that I didn't recognize, a car that cost more than most people's annual salary, judging by the pristine condition and luxury model. Everything about it screamed success, confidence, belonging, everything I apparently no longer possessed in my own home. Richard appeared on the porch before I'd even turned off the engine. Up close, he was even more imposing than I'd glimpsed from the gate. Probably 6'2", with silver gray hair that looked professionally styled and a tan that spoke of recent vacations in expensive places. He wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater and dark slacks that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. When he smiled, it was the practiced smile of someone accustomed to making good first impressions. "You must be our potential buyer," he called out, striding down the steps with his hand extended. "Richard Patterson. Welcome to our little slice of paradise." Richard Patterson. He'd taken not just my wife, not just my house, but my last name as well. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the expensive watch on his wrist, the confident way he held eye contact. "James Morrison," I replied, pulling the false name from somewhere deep in my shocked brain. "Thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice." "Not a problem at all," Richard said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Milena and I were just discussing how this property has such good energy that it practically sells itself. Come on up to the house. She's preparing some coffee." He turned and walked toward the front door, my front door, with the casual ownership of someone who'd walked that path 1,000 times. I followed, noting how he paused to straighten a planter that had shifted slightly, how he automatically held the door open with a muscle memory of routine. This wasn't recent. Whatever this was had been going on for a long time. The interior of the house hit me like a physical blow. It had been completely transformed since my last visit 6 months ago. Gone were the neutral tones and simple furniture I'd helped Milena choose. Instead, the living room was decorated in rich burgundies and golds, with artwork I'd never seen before hanging on walls I'd paid to have painted. Expensive Persian rugs covered the hardwood floors I'd had refinished 3 years ago. But it wasn't just the decor. It was the feeling of the space itself. The house felt lived in, settled, as if two people had been building a life here together for years. Family photos sat on the mantelpiece, photos that featured Milena and Richard in various poses of domestic bliss. Hiking together, cooking together, laughing together on the very porch where I now stood as an unwelcome stranger. "Milena, darling," Richard called out toward the kitchen. "Our visitor is here." She appeared in the doorway, and for a moment my breath caught in my throat. At 52, Milena was still beautiful, perhaps more beautiful than when I'd married her. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a flowing dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine about country living. But it was the expression on her face that nearly broke me. She looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. When her eyes met mine, there wasn't even a flicker of recognition. No shock, no guilt, no fear. She looked at me the same way she might look at any stranger who'd wandered into her perfect life. "You must be James," she said, moving forward with her hand outstretched. "I'm Milena Patterson. Richard's told me you are interested in the property." I took her hand, the same hand that had worn my wedding ring for 23 years, though now it bore a different band entirely, and managed to find my voice. "That's right. I hope you don't mind me saying, but you have the most beautiful home I've ever seen." Her face lit up with genuine pride. "Thank you so much. Richard and I have put a lot of love into this place. It's been our sanctuary for the past few years." "The past few years, not months, years." "Please sit down," Richard said, gesturing toward the sofa, a piece of furniture I'd never seen before that probably cost more than my car. "Milena makes the most incredible coffee. We get the beans specially imported from a little farm in Guatemala." As they moved around each other in the living room, I watched their interactions with a mixture of fascination and horror. There was an easy intimacy between them, a natural rhythm that spoke of countless mornings spent together, countless evenings sharing this space. Richard's hand found the small of Milena's back as she passed him. She automatically straightened his collar when she noticed it was slightly askew. These were the unconscious gestures of a couple deeply comfortable with each other. "So, James," Milena said as she settled into the chair across from me, my favorite reading chair that I'd bought from an antique shop in Cambridge 7 years ago. "What draws you to this area? It's rather off the beaten path." I'd prepared for this question during the drive up from the gate. "I'm recently retired," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "I've been looking for somewhere peaceful to write my memoirs. The isolation appeals to me." "How wonderful," she said, and I could hear genuine enthusiasm in her voice. "What sort of work were you in?" "Finance," I replied, choosing something vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. "Corporate consulting mostly. Nothing very interesting." Richard leaned forward with interest. "You know, that's exactly the kind of background this area could use more of. Too many of the old families have let their properties run down because they don't understand modern financial planning." The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard was sitting in my house wearing my wife's attention like a comfortable sweater, lecturing me about financial planning. "The previous owner was exactly that type," Milena added, settling back in her chair with her coffee cup cradled in her hands. "A sweet man, but completely impractical when it came to money matters. He bought this place as some sort of investment, but he never really understood how to maintain a property like this." "Previous owner." I gripped my own coffee cup tighter, using the heat to keep my hands from shaking. "What happened to him?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. Richard and Milena exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that couples develop over time. "Divorce," Milena said with a slight shrug. "His wife finally got tired of his financial irresponsibility and took him to the cleaners. Poor man had to sell everything just to pay the settlement." The room spun slightly around me. In her version of events, I was the failed husband. I was the one who'd been left behind, the one who'd lost everything. She'd rewritten our entire history to make herself the victor in a story I didn't even know we were writing. "That's unfortunate," I managed to say. "It really was," she continued, warming to her subject. "But it worked out perfectly for Richard and me. We'd been looking for exactly this kind of property for months. The timing was almost too good to be true. Almost like it was meant to be." Richard added, reaching over to squeeze her hand. As I watched my wife of 23 years smile lovingly at another man in the house I'd bought for her while she told stories about my own demise, one thought crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I was sitting in the middle of the most elaborate lie I'd ever encountered, and the woman I'd loved for more than half my adult life was its architect. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Milena asked, rising from her chair with the graceful movements of a woman completely at ease in her surroundings. "Richard's done some wonderful renovations since we've been here." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Every room would be another knife twist, another reminder of how thoroughly I'd been erased from my own life. But I needed to see it all. I needed to understand the scope of what had been done to me. Richard led the way, his hand naturally finding the small of Milena's back as they walked. "We've really tried to honor the original character of the house while making it more functional for modern living," he explained, guiding me toward what had once been my home office. The moment we stepped through the doorway, I felt the blood drain from my face. My desk, the antique mahogany piece I'd inherited from my grandfather, still sat in its familiar spot by the window. But everything else had changed. My books were gone, replaced by volumes on art history and wine collecting. My filing cabinets had been replaced with an elegant credenza that held crystal decanters and expensive-looking pottery. "This is Richard's study," Milena said proudly. "He's quite the collector of rare books." I stared at my grandfather's desk, now covered with papers that belonged to another man. Richard moved behind it with the casual ownership of someone who'd claimed the space completely. As he gestured toward some architectural drawings spread across the surface, I caught sight of something that made my heart stop. There, partially visible beneath the renovation plans, was the corner of a document with my name on it. Not James Morrison, the fake name I'd been using, but my real name, Colin Patterson. My hands began to shake as I realized what I was looking at. "The previous owner left quite a bit of paperwork behind," Richard was saying, apparently noticing my stare. "Legal documents, property records, that sort of thing. We've been meaning to have it all properly disposed of, but you know how these things go. Richard's been handling all the legal aspects of the property transfer," Milena added. "He's much better with that sort of thing than I am." The casual way she said it, as if transferring my property to another man was just another household chore, nearly broke my composure entirely. I forced myself to focus on the papers visible on the desk, trying to make out more details without appearing suspicious. "You know," I said, moving slightly closer to the desk, "I'm always curious about the legal side of property acquisitions. Was this a complicated transfer?" Richard's expression brightened with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed talking about his accomplishments. "Actually, it was surprisingly straightforward once we got all the documentation sorted out. The previous owner's divorce settlement required him to liquidate his assets quickly, so he was motivated to sell." Divorce settlement. The lie came so easily from his lips that I almost believed he believed it himself. "The tricky part," Richard continued, "was dealing with some irregularities in the original deed. Apparently, the previous owner had some financial difficulties that complicated the paperwork. But we managed to get everything sorted out through proper legal channels." As he spoke, he casually shuffled the papers on the desk, and I caught a glimpse of something that sent ice through my veins. There, clearly visible for just a moment, was what appeared to be my signature on a document I'd never seen before. Not a photocopy or a scan, but what looked like an original signature in blue ink. My throat went dry. I knew my own signature, had seen it on thousands of documents over the years. And that was definitely my signature, on a paper I had absolutely no memory of signing. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Could I trouble you for your restroom?" "Of course," Milena said immediately. "Down the hall, second door on the right, the same place it's always been." She caught herself immediately, but not quickly enough. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, revealing the slip she hadn't meant to make. For the first time since I'd arrived, uncertainty flickered across her face. Richard's eyes sharpened slightly, but he covered it with a smooth laugh. "What Milena means is that old houses like this tend to have very predictable layouts. The restroom is exactly where you'd expect it to be." I nodded and excused myself, but instead of heading directly to the bathroom, I took a detour through the hallway that led to what had once been our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see inside without being obvious about it. The room had been completely transformed. Gone was the simple, comfortable furniture Milena and I had chosen together. In its place was an elaborate bedroom suite that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. But it was the personal touches that hit me hardest. Framed photos of Milena and Richard on the bedside tables, his clothes hanging in the closet I'd built with my own hands, her jewelry scattered across the vanity I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. On the dresser, partially hidden behind a vase of fresh flowers, I spotted something that made my chest tighten with rage. It was our wedding photo, or rather, it had been our wedding photo. Someone had carefully cut me out of the picture, leaving just Milena in her wedding dress, smiling at empty space, where I used to stand. The sight of my own image, literally erased from our most important moment, filled me with a cold fury I'd never experienced before. But it also clarified something important. This wasn't just about an affair or even about money. This was about completely eliminating my existence from Milena's life, as if our 23 years together had never happened. I forced myself to continue to the bathroom, where I splashed cold water on my face and tried to process what I'd seen. The forged signature, the casual lies about property transfers, the methodical erasure of our shared history. It all pointed to something far more calculating than a simple extramarital affair. When I returned to the study, Richard and Milena were deep in quiet conversation. They stopped talking the moment I appeared, both turning to me with bright smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "I hope you don't mind," Richard said, "but while you were gone, Milena and I were discussing your situation. If you're serious about wanting to purchase a property in this area, we might be able to help you more than you realize." "What do you mean?" I asked, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there immediately. Milena leaned forward with the same expression she used to wear when she was excited about a new art project. "Well, the thing is, we've been considering expanding our real estate portfolio. Richard has such a good eye for undervalued properties, and there are several places in this area that might be perfect for someone with your background. We could potentially act as consultants," Richard added smoothly. "Help you identify the right property, navigate the local market, handle the legal complexities. For a reasonable fee, of course." The audacity of it took my breath away. They were trying to sell me more property, probably using the same fraudulent methods they'd used to steal mine. Milena was sitting in my house wearing jewelry I'd bought her, proposing to help another man avoid the financial mistakes that had supposedly destroyed her previous marriage. "That's very generous," I managed to say. "But I should probably think it over. This is a big decision." "Of course," Milena said warmly. "But don't think too long. Properties in this area don't stay on the market very long when they're properly priced." As they walked me back toward the front door, I caught one more glimpse of the study. The papers were still scattered across my grandfather's desk, but now they were arranged differently. Richard had been careful to cover the documents with my name on them, but not careful enough. I could still see the edge of what looked like a deed transfer and the corner of what might have been a power of attorney. Standing on the porch where I'd said goodbye to Milena countless times before, shaking hands with the man who'd stolen my life, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. They weren't just thieves. They were professionals. This wasn't Richard's first time doing this, and it wouldn't be his last. "We'll be in touch soon," Richard said, his grip firm and confident. "I have a feeling this is going to work out very well for all of us." As I walked back to my car, I could feel them watching me from the porch. When I turned back for one last look at the house I'd bought with 20 years of careful saving, I saw Milena waving goodbye with the same gesture she'd used when I left for business trips. But now I understood the truth. She hadn't been saying goodbye to her husband leaving for work. She'd been practicing for the day she'd wave goodbye to me forever. The drive back to Boston passed in a blur of rage and disbelief. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and every few miles I had to pull over to catch my breath. The image of my forged signature kept flashing through my mind, along with Milena's casual dismissal of our 23-year marriage as the failed relationship of an impractical man. By the time I reached my apartment, the small sterile place that had become my refuge since Milena started spending all her time at our country house, it was nearly midnight, but sleep was impossible. Instead, I sat at my computer and began researching Richard Patterson, the man who had stolen my life. What I found in those first few hours of searching made my blood run cold. Richard Patterson wasn't just a name my wife's lover had adopted. It was an identity he'd constructed with meticulous care. According to public records, Richard Patterson had been born 53 years ago in Connecticut, had attended prestigious schools, and had worked in international consulting before retiring early to pursue private investments. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man a woman like Milena would find attractive, successful, sophisticated, financially secure. But as I dug deeper, using the investigative skills I'd developed during my years in corporate finance, cracks began to appear in the perfect facade. The Connecticut birth records were real, but they belonged to a Richard Patterson who had died in a car accident 28 years ago at the age of 25. The school records existed, but when I cross-referenced them with alumni databases, there was no trace of anyone matching the description of the man I'd met. The consulting firm he'd supposedly worked for had been dissolved 15 years ago, leaving no paper trail of his employment. Richard Patterson, the man currently sleeping in my bed with my wife, was a ghost, a carefully constructed identity built on the bones of a dead man's life. I spent the next 3 days consuming every piece of information I could find about identity theft, real estate fraud, and something called romance scams. What I discovered made me sick to my stomach. Richard wasn't just a simple con artist. He was part of a sophisticated network that targeted wealthy, lonely women, wormed their way into their lives, and systematically stripped them of their assets. The pattern was always the same. Identify a vulnerable target, create an attractive false identity, establish an emotional connection, isolate the victim from their support network, and then manipulate them into transferring property or assets. By the time the victims realized what had happened, the perpetrators had vanished, leaving behind nothing but forged documents and broken lives. But there was something different about Milena's case. In every other instance I could find, the victims had eventually discovered the truth and attempted to seek justice. My wife, however, seemed to be a willing participant in her own deception. She wasn't just a victim, she was an accomplice. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Milena hadn't been seduced and manipulated. She had actively chosen to betray me, to rewrite our history, to steal my property and give it to another man. The woman I'd loved for more than half my adult life had looked at our marriage and decided it was worth less than whatever Richard had promised her. On the fourth day, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I hired a private investigator. Margaret Chen came highly recommended by my lawyer, who had handled enough messy divorces to know the value of professional investigation. She was a small, precise woman in her early 60s who spoke with the calm authority of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human betrayal. "Your wife's boyfriend has done this before," she told me after reviewing the information I'd gathered. We were sitting in her office in downtown Boston, surrounded by filing cabinets full of other people's shattered lives. The Richard Patterson identity is just his latest creation. We've been tracking this particular individual for 3 years now. My heart stopped. "You know who he really is?" Margaret nodded grimly. "His real name is Robert Palmer, originally from Michigan. He's 47 years old, has a criminal record dating back to his 20s, and has been running sophisticated romance scams across New England for at least a decade. Your wife is his fourth victim that we know of." Fourth victim. The words echoed in my head as Margaret spread out a series of photographs on her desk. Each one showed Robert Palmer, Richard Patterson, with a different woman. All of them were attractive, well-dressed, and middle-aged. All of them were smiling at the camera with the same expression of contentment I'd seen on Milena's face. "What happened to the others?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The first one, Sandra Mitchell from Maine, lost her house and her life savings before she figured out what was happening. She tried to press charges, but Palmer had already moved on. The second victim, Patricia Wayne from New Hampshire, actually married him before discovering the truth. She's still fighting to recover her assets through the courts. Margaret pulled out another photograph, this one showing a woman who looked remarkably similar to Milena. Dark hair, elegant features, the kind of refined beauty that suggested education and social status. The third victim was Jennifer Rothschild from Massachusetts. She was a widow with substantial assets, much like your wife's situation. Palmer convinced her to transfer ownership of her late husband's real estate portfolio to him for tax purposes. By the time she realized what had happened, he'd sold everything and disappeared. And Milena? Margaret's expression grew even more serious. Your wife's case is different. In the previous instances, Palmer targeted women who were isolated, widows, divorces, women who had few close family connections to interfere with his plans. But your wife is still married? She has a husband who could potentially discover the fraud and take action to stop it. The implication hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. You think he's planning to get rid of me permanently? I think, Margaret said carefully, that your wife's cooperation in this scheme suggests a level of planning that goes beyond simple financial fraud. The forged documents you saw, the systematic erasure of your presence from the property, the stories about your supposed divorce. These aren't the actions of a woman who's been manipulated. These are the actions of someone who's actively participating in making you disappear. She leaned forward, her eyes holding mine with uncomfortable intensity. Mr. Patterson, I need you to understand something very important. In 2 of Palmer's previous cases, the victims' former partners died in what appeared to be accidents shortly before the financial transfers were completed. A car crash in Maine, a drowning accident in New Hampshire. Both deaths removed the last potential obstacles to Palmer's plans. The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, struggling to process what Margaret was telling me. Milena wasn't just stealing my property, she was helping to plan my elimination. What do I do? I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. Margaret gathered up the photographs and placed them back in their folder. First, we document everything. Every fraudulent document, every forged signature, every illegal transfer. We build a case that will hold up in court and put Palmer away for a very long time. She paused, studying my face with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen too many people make bad decisions in desperate situations. But more importantly, she continued, we make sure you stay alive long enough to see justice done, because if I'm right about Palmer's plans, you're not just a victim of fraud, you're a target for elimination. As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, walking through the busy streets of Boston where I'd lived and worked for 30 years, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Every car that passed too close, every stranger who looked at me twice, every unexpected sound made my heart race with paranoia. But underneath the fear, something else was growing, a cold, calculating determination that I'd never felt before. If Milena and her accomplice thought they could erase me from existence, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I was still alive, I still had resources they didn't know about, and now I knew exactly who I was fighting. The game was far from over. The next 2 weeks became the most intensely focused period of my life. Working with Margaret and a team of forensic accountants she recommended, I methodically documented every aspect of the fraud that had been perpetrated against me. What we uncovered was even more extensive than I'd initially imagined. Robert Palmer, I refused to think of him as Richard anymore, had been systematically transferring my assets for over 8 months. Not just the country house, but investments, bank accounts, even the retirement fund I'd been building for 30 years. Milena had provided him with access to everything, signing documents with a version of my signature that had been practiced to perfection. The most damning evidence came from security cameras at various banks and legal offices. Margaret's contacts in law enforcement helped us obtain footage showing Milena and Palmer together, conducting business with forged power of attorney documents. In one particularly clear recording, Palmer could be seen coaching Milena on how to sign my name. Their heads bent together over paperwork like conspirators planning a heist. Because that's exactly what they were. But the discovery that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret called me with news that made my blood run cold. We found Palmer's next target, she said without preamble. Her name is Dorothy Henshaw. She's a 72-year-old widow from Newport who inherited a substantial estate from her late husband. Palmer has already made contact. My heart sank. Another woman about to be destroyed by the man who'd stolen my life. What's the timeline? Based on his previous patterns, he's probably 3 to 4 weeks away from beginning the property transfers. But here's the thing, Colin. We found communications between Palmer and Milena discussing their plans for Mrs. Henshaw. And your name came up. I gripped the phone tighter. What do you mean? They're planning to use your tragic accident as part of their story with the new victim. According to their correspondence, they're going to tell Mrs. Henshaw that Milena is a recent widow who lost her beloved husband in a car crash, which is why she's so grateful to have found love again with Richard. Your death is supposed to generate sympathy and trust. The casual way they discussed my planned murder, as if it were just another element in their romantic fiction, filled me with a rage so pure it was almost liberating. They had underestimated me completely, treating me like an obstacle to be removed rather than an opponent capable of fighting back. There's more, Margaret continued. We intercepted communications suggesting that Palmer is getting impatient with the current scheme. He's pressuring Milena to accelerate the timeline for your elimination. They are planning something for this weekend. This weekend. 4 days away. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment made me jump. Every car that lingered too long in the parking lot sent my heart racing. But by morning my fear had crystallized into something far more useful. A plan. I called in sick to work, not difficult to do convincingly given that I looked like hell, and spent the day making preparations. I transferred what remained of my accessible funds to accounts Palmer didn't know about. I made copies of all the evidence Margaret had gathered and stored them in multiple secure locations. I wrote detailed letters explaining everything I'd discovered and arranged for them to be delivered to law enforcement if anything happened to me. But most importantly, I made a phone call that would change everything. Mrs. Henshaw, my name is Colin Patterson, and I believe you are in terrible danger. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. Dorothy Henshaw was a sharp, intelligent woman who initially reacted with skepticism to my warnings about the man she knew as Richard Patterson. But when I showed her the photographs Margaret had compiled, when I played her recordings of Palmer using the same romantic lines he'd used on his previous victims, her disbelief crumbled into horror. He seemed so genuine, she whispered over the phone. He told me about losing his previous girlfriend in a car accident, how devastated he was, how grateful he felt to have found love again. Mrs. Henshaw, I said gently, that previous girlfriend is my wife, and I'm the one who's supposed to die in that car accident. By Thursday evening, everything was in place. Dorothy Henshaw had agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, wearing recording equipment during her scheduled meeting with Palmer the following evening. Federal agents brought in because Palmer had crossed state lines were positioned to make arrests the moment financial documents were presented for signature. But I had one more card to play, a personal confrontation that would ensure Milena understood exactly what she had lost. I drove to the country house on Friday morning, timing my arrival for when I knew Palmer would be away, meeting with his legal contacts about the Dorothy Henshaw scheme. The same groundskeeper let me through the gate, still believing I was James Morrison, the potential buyer who'd visited weeks earlier. Milena was in the garden, tending to flowers I'd helped her plant 3 years ago. She looked up with surprise when she saw me approaching, but her expression quickly shifted to the polite smile she reserved for unwanted guests. James, she said, straightening up and brushing dirt from her hands. This is unexpected. Richard isn't here right now, but I'm sure he'll be back soon if you'd like to wait. I stood there looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time in months. She was still beautiful, still carried herself with the grace that had first attracted me 24 years ago. But now I could see the hardness in her eyes, the calculation behind her smile. I'm not here to see Richard, I said quietly. I'm here to see you, Milena. She blinked, and for just a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. I'm sorry, but do we know each other? I don't think we've been properly introduced. The audacity of it, standing in the garden of the house I'd bought for her, wearing earrings I'd given her for our anniversary, pretending we were strangers, finally broke the last restraints on my anger. 23 years, I said, stepping closer. 23 years of marriage, and you can look me in the eye and pretend you don't know who I am. The color drained from her face. She took a step backward, her hand instinctively moving to her throat, where she still wore the locket I'd given her on our first anniversary. Colin, she whispered, and hearing my real name from her lips after weeks of being treated like a ghost sent a shiver down my spine. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Did you think you could steal my life, plan my murder, and I'd just disappear quietly? Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly. For the first time since this nightmare began, Milena looked genuinely terrified. "I know about Robert Palmer," I continued. "I know about his previous victims. I know about the forged documents, the stolen assets, the whole elaborate scheme you've been running. And I know about your plans for this weekend." Tears began to stream down her cheeks, but I felt no sympathy. These weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic at being caught. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she finally managed to say. "You were never supposed to find out." "Find out that my wife was planning to have me killed? No, I imagine that was meant to stay secret." She shook her head frantically. "It's not what you think, Colin. Robert said we could just disappear, start over somewhere else. He said you'd be better off without me anyway." The pathetic attempt at justification, as if murdering me would somehow be doing me a favor, filled me with disgust. This woman who'd shared my bed, my dreams, my life for more than 2 decades had convinced herself that my death would be a kindness. "Where is he, Milena? Where's Robert right now?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara across her cheeks. "He's meeting with lawyers in Newport about another property investment. He'll be back tonight." But he wouldn't be back tonight. At this very moment, Robert Palmer was being arrested by federal agents while attempting to defraud Dorothy Henshaw. The carefully constructed life he'd built with my wife was crashing down around him, and soon it would be Milena's turn to face the consequences of her choices. "There's something you should know," I said, watching her face carefully. "Robert's been arrested. The FBI has been watching him for weeks, documenting everything. They have recordings, photographs, financial records, everything they need to put him away for the rest of his life." Milena's legs seemed to give out beneath her. She sank down onto the garden bench, her face a mask of shock and despair. "And they have evidence of your involvement, too," I continued. "Every forged signature, every fraudulent document, every asset transfer, it's all documented. You're going to prison, Milena, for a very long time." She looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the woman I'd once loved. Vulnerable, frightened, desperate. "Colin, please," she whispered. "I know I made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can work something out." But it was too late for that. Far too late. "The only thing you can do now," I said, turning to walk away, "is hope that the prosecutor shows you more mercy than you showed me." As I reached the gate, I heard her calling my name, her voice breaking with desperation. But I didn't look back. The woman crying in that garden wasn't my wife anymore. She was a stranger who'd worn Milena's face while plotting my destruction. And now she would face the consequences of her choices alone. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Boston, watching as Milena Patterson, she'd kept my name even after everything, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and accessory to attempted murder. Robert Palmer had already been sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole, his long history of similar crimes finally catching up with him. The woman in the orange jumpsuit bore little resemblance to the elegant socialite who'd once graced my arm at charity galas and dinner parties. Prison had stripped away the careful makeup, the expensive clothes, the polished facade that had hidden her true nature from me for so many years. When the judge read her sentence, she didn't cry or plead or show any sign of the vulnerability she'd tried to use to manipulate me during our final confrontation. She just looked empty, hollow, like a shell of a person who'd finally run out of lies to tell. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, she turned to look at me one last time. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering love for the woman I'd spent 23 years trying to make happy. Just the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice served. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Torres, who'd become something of a specialist in Palmer's type of fraud, approached me as the courtroom emptied. "Mr. Patterson, I wanted to thank you again for your cooperation in this case. Without your willingness to come forward and work with law enforcement, Palmer would have continued victimizing innocent people." I shook her hand, thinking about Dorothy Henshaw, who'd sent me a heartfelt letter thanking me for saving her from financial ruin. It was the right thing to do. "The asset recovery team will have your property fully restored within the next 30 days. Torres continued. All fraudulent transfers have been reversed and you should have complete access to your accounts by the end of the week. I nodded, though the money and property felt less important now than they had 6 months ago. The real victory wasn't getting my assets back, it was getting my life back. Outside the courthouse, Margaret Chen was waiting for me with a small smile that suggested satisfaction at a job well done. "So," she said as we walked toward the parking garage, "what are your plans now? Are you going to keep the country house?" I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The house in Vermont held too many memories. Not just of the betrayal, but of the years when I'd been genuinely happy there with a woman who'd never really existed. The Milena I'd loved had been a carefully constructed fiction, as false as Richard Patterson's identity. "I'm selling it," I said. "I've already found a buyer, a young couple with 2 kids who will actually appreciate what it has to offer." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Starting fresh?" "Exactly. And that's what I was doing. Starting completely fresh at 57 years old, with a clarity about life that I'd never possessed before. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had also freed me from illusions I hadn't even known I was carrying. 3 weeks later, I stood on the deck of a small cabin I'd purchased in the mountains of North Carolina, a place Milena had never seen, where no memories of our life together could intrude. The cabin was modest compared to the Vermont estate, but it was entirely mine, paid for with money that had never been touched by fraud or deception. My neighbor, a retired teacher named Helen, who lived about a quarter mile down the mountain road, had invited me to a community potluck dinner that evening. It would be my first social gathering since the trial, my first attempt at building relationships that weren't built on lies or manipulation. I was nervous about it, if I'm being honest. After what I'd been through, trusting people felt like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. But I was learning that isolation wasn't safety. It was just another kind of prison. As I dressed for the dinner, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked different than I had a year ago. Thinner, certainly. The stress had taken its toll, but also more alert, more present. The passive complacency that had allowed me to miss the signs of Milena's betrayal was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence I'd never possessed before. The potluck was held in the community center, a rustic building that hosted everything from town meetings to wedding receptions. When I arrived carrying a store-bought pie, cooking had never been my strong suit. I was immediately welcomed by people who knew nothing about my past except that I was the new guy who'd bought the Henderson place. Helen introduced me around with the easy familiarity of someone who'd lived in the community for decades. There was Bob, who ran the local hardware store and immediately offered to help me with any repairs the cabin might need. There was Sarah, a nurse at the county hospital, who mentioned that the local hiking club was always looking for new members. There was Tom, a retired mechanic who owned the garage down in the valley and said I should bring my car by for a tune-up before winter. These were genuine offers of friendship and assistance, made without expectation of anything in return. The contrast to the calculated manipulation I'd lived with for years was so stark it was almost overwhelming. As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. When Bob told a story about his grandson's attempts to help with yard work, I laughed without calculating whether my response was appropriate. When Sarah mentioned that her book club was reading a mystery novel that reminded her of something that might interest me, I accepted her offer to lend me a copy without wondering what she might want from me in return. This was what normal human interaction felt like. This was what I'd forgotten during all those years of walking on eggshells around Milena's moods and needs and carefully orchestrated social performances. Driving home that night along the dark mountain roads, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince himself that his life was working, but the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life actually was working. Back at the cabin, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the deck, looking out at stars that were invisible in the light-polluted skies of Boston. The silence was complete except for the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I thought about my future with genuine excitement rather than grim determination. I was 57 years old, financially secure and completely free to build whatever life I wanted. There were books I wanted to read, places I wanted to travel, friendships I wanted to cultivate without the toxic influence of someone who saw every relationship as an opportunity for manipulation. I thought about Milena, sitting in her federal prison cell, probably still trying to figure out how to work the system to her advantage. The woman who'd been so focused on appearances and social status was now wearing identical clothes to murderers and drug dealers, eating institutional food, sleeping on a narrow cot in a shared cell. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the casual way she'd discussed my planned murder with her accomplice, and the sympathy evaporated. Some people make their own prisons through their choices, and Milena had constructed hers with remarkable thoroughness. My phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer, confirming that the sale of the Vermont house had gone through without complications. The final ties to my old life had been severed. The money from the sale, combined with my recovered assets, meant I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working again if I chose. But I was already thinking about what kind of work I might want to do. Something meaningful, something that helped people rather than just generating profit. Maybe something with Margaret's investigative firm, helping other victims of fraud recover their lives. Maybe volunteer work with programs that helped people rebuild after financial crime. I had time to figure it out. For the first time in my adult life, I had unlimited time to discover who I really was when I wasn't desperately trying to make someone else happy. The coffee grew cold as I sat there planning and dreaming under a sky full of stars that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. In the distance, I could see the lights of Helen's house, warm and welcoming in the darkness. Tomorrow, I would start building the authentic life I'd never known I wanted. Tonight, I was simply grateful to be alive to see another day, something that 6 months ago had been far from guaranteed. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to the mountain, to the stars, and to whatever came next. Freedom tasted better than I'd ever imagined.